You are listening to Fika with Vicky on United Public Radio, 107.7 and 105.3 from New Orleans.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fika. With today's guest, author and fairy expert Morgan Daimler, and me, your host, Vicky Benison. But before we get started, I just want to take a moment to give a special thanks to Morgan, because this interview was scheduled back in June, but I had a family illness and had to cancel last minute, and she was so kind and understanding. I think the fairies would be pleased, or Morgan would say so. For sure. I would also like to thank, he just popped up with his own message, my husband. A happy 32nd anniversary. We've come a long way, baby. And I've been very patient. Now, back to our introduction. We're going to be focusing on Morgan's latest work, Fairy, The Otherworld by Many Names, published by Moon Books, and her re-released independent book, Fairy Faith for Children. It doesn't seem to matter how many books Morgan puts out on Our Good Neighbours. They always come up with new information on this fascinating topic, not only sharing this research through their books, but also teaching classes on Irish myth, magical practices, related subjects, as well as fairies across the United States and internationally. And don't forget the anthologies and magazines they've contributed to. Thanks for always sharing your knowledge so generously and your kindness, Morgan. Welcome back to Fika.
Thank you for having me back. I'm excited to talk with you today.
There are a lot of exciting things to talk about. First of all, I want to say we cannot go over all the subjects that Morgan has put into Fairy, The Otherworld by Many Names, because this one's very in depth and very specific. So I suggest if you want to learn more on the subject, you really are going to have to go buy the book, because there is no show that can cover everything in detail that she's put out there for us. But, and that being said, I did mention that you've written a lot of books on fairies. I was going to count them, and then I thought,
don't do that.
So why this one? Was it something you thought needed to be put out there, or were you just more curious?
Yeah, it was something that I thought needed to be put out there. And I had a couple requests on social media for something on this topic, because it is something that can be a source of a lot of confusion. We talk about the world of fairy, Otherworld, Elfland, whatever we're calling it. I don't think people realize how much depth there is to the beliefs. And a lot of them were very culturally or regionally specific. So like the way it's viewed in Scotland is not the same as the way it's viewed in Ireland, which is not the same as Wales, which is not the same as England, and so on. But we tend to approach it like it's this one big, homogenous subject. And what happens then is people get very confused about what we're talking about. Why are these different names used? Why does this one source say this thing, but this other source is saying something totally different? So I felt like it would be really helpful to have a single book that kind of looked at all of that and kind of separated out, okay, this is where we're getting this idea. This is what they believed here. This is kind of where this is coming from. And I thought that would be a good way for people to get a better understanding of it that maybe wasn't as overwhelming.
Well, good luck.
As much as possible.
And you did it well. I think we forget, because people think fairy and they simplify it, is that these people, and that's what I'm going to call them for lack of, these people are come from different areas of the world just like we do. And so there's going to be different, stories and customs and that for each of them. As well as one of the confusing things right off the bat is that fairy is the name of these people. What would you call them? This group
Um,
of beings, this
yeah, I tend to say otherworldly beings.
otherworldly beings? Okay, we'll go with that. I should have asked you in the south.
That's okay.
So this otherworldly beings are called fairies, but also their land is called fairy. So it can get a little one of their lands are called fairies. So it can get a little confusing, right?
Okay. Yeah, your microphone got a little weird there. Right?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, I can hear you okay now. Yeah, it's interesting when we look back at the word. It originally in French meant, because it comes from French, I should probably start by saying that. Originally, it came from French in like the 12th century, and it meant something that had like an enchanting nature. So it would be implied even to humans, like human witches were sometimes referred to as this. So hence we get like Morgan Le Fay. Because that, oddly enough, that Arthurian tale was originally written in France by a French author that we have. So that kind of concept. But when it came into English about 100 years later, it originally was used for the place. So it was this place, the land of fairy, this enchanting, magical land that is not the human world, but is adjacent to it, connected to it. And from there came to be applied to the beings that were from that world or things that had a similar nature. So it gets very complicated even just digging into the word part of it. But that's why we have the land named fairy, and then the beings from that place are also called fairies or a fairy, sort of indicating that this is where they're from. This is what their connection is to this world of magic and enchantment, which makes it sound much more fun than it actually is in the stories, I have to say.
Well, this is what I wanted to ask too, near the beginning, as a disclaimer, because I don't want people running out there and jumping into the world of fairy. Would you want to go to the fairy? And if so, why? And why do you think maybe people shouldn't?
Would I personally want to?
Well, you would.
Yeah, I mean, I would. But I've also been studying this for a very long time, and I have sort of very deep-seated fascination with this whole subject. So, yeah, in all honesty, I would. Is that a smart decision? Not necessarily, but, not everything I do is always smart decisions. The biggest thing with the world of fairy, and why I usually caution people, because there's all those jokes that go around on social media about, jumping into fairy rings and wanting to be kidnapped by the good folk, by the fairies. The biggest thing I caution people is that when we look across sort of the whole range of material we have, a couple thousand years all across Western Europe, we find that while sometimes these encounters can be good, like humans wander into the world of fairy or are taken there and they have positive experiences overall, a lot of times they're not. A lot of times it's a place that can have a lot of dangers in it, and a lot of risk. And there also are many, many, many stories where a human gets kidnapped into this world, and much like most kidnappings, not for positive reasons, nefarious purposes, I guess you would say, and they end up trapped in that world and also trapped in a very unpleasant sort of situation. So I think that today we can't tend to kind of romanticize the concept and think of fairy as this almost like paradise, this wonderful place where everyone's happy and all that. But when we actually look at all of the stories that we have, even some of the modern experiences people talk about having, they're really not like that. It's like the tourist brochure for a place versus like what that place is actually going to be like, if that makes sense to everyone. So I usually caution people that maybe don't assume you would want to go there, because it probably would not end well for you as a human, unless you're the main character in a novel, and then the odds might be
And then we can all live vicariously through that character. But as you were talking, I just envisioned, because as you write in the books, they're not always these little beings that we think of them as. They can be human size, giving out brochures towards the land of fairy because they want to hear some fiddle music or whatever.
Yes. Yeah, and they would, you know.
They would.
I might work that into a story in the future, actually.
That's okay.
Sure.
They're being in they're being, yes, one of our favorite movies in this house, thank you for the reminder, is well, not favorite movies, but it makes us laugh, is Eurovision with Will Ferrell, and the line, the fairies have gone too far.
Yes, the elves have gone too far.
Yeah, that's it. I just want to get a t-shirt that says that.
I like the part too. I'm not going to spoiler it by giving it any context, but later on in the movie, when he's like, "Thank you for the murder."
Yeah, I love those elves. I get them.
And that is such a great example for people who have seen the movie, because they're kind of mercurial like that. They're acting in ways to help people, but also ways that involve blowing things up and murder. So, one person's help
go too
is another person's
demise.
Not help.
Yes.
And I think that's an aspect of this whole concept and the belief system around it that people tend to forget. They do. They think more, like you said, of the tiny, cute little helpful ones, the little garden fairies, flower fairies, and not maybe so much of the ones that are like in Eurovision.
I do love that line. And if you're out there and you need a laugh today, I say turn into Eurovision, because
it's absolutely ridiculous. It's a very funny movie.
Yeah, so you will find no depth whatsoever. It is It's a Will Ferrell movie. What can I say? But it's one that I enjoy.
Yeah, don't take it seriously at all. But I have to say their depiction of the elves was actually pretty good. Surprisingly.
I thought of you, Morgan. When I watched it.
I love that movie.
And so, as we were just saying, perfect segue in, because of books and movies, we tend to have that innocent belief in fairies, and that they all come from the forest and they're flying from flower to flower, whatever. But in fairy, the Otherworld with many names, I have to add the little ending because she has so many books of fairies. So I want to say
it's really unfortunate that the way algorithms work and the way you have to put things out there in order to get the audience to find them. I do unfortunately have multiple books with very similar sounding titles, so I apologize for that.
So we have to do the whole thing, even here today, so I don't get confused. But from what you have researched, they have a separate world. And you say, this is very complicated again, people. You say it is a separate place, but you also say that seeing the other world as a separate place could create an obstacle to completely understanding it. So I'm coming to the source to get the cheat notes on how to interpret that. And I'm listening.
Yeah, I think that when we talk about it as being an other world, which it is in the sources and the belief, I think if you take that too far and you start to imagine it as like a completely separate, distinct reality, then you lose sort of the nuances where it is really overlapped into our world.
Right.
The way I'll often explain this to people, just to use an analogy, is it's like a piece of paper. Our world is on one side of the piece of paper and the other world is on the other side. They're separate, but they're joined.
Okay, like a curtain.
Yes.
between
way to
the
look at
two. So if you pass into this, so yes, it's adjacent world, another dimension. And when people speak of going through the veil or finding, a doorway into fairy, they just happen to be on that edge.
Yeah, there's a term you'll find in a lot of folklore, at least in places like Ireland, called thin places. And it's kind of those places where that separation is not as distinct. That overlap is stronger. And I think that's why it's important to understand it not as a completely separate thing, but as something that is
Right. It is
separate but
accessible.
attached. Yeah.
Either way, they can come here, we can go there. And as you said, in the in between places. So on a shore, between the water and the land, at a certain point of day, dusk, when it's not quite daytime and it's not quite nighttime. At the seasons change. There's are all ways that you have related that you can pass through.
Yeah. The beings themselves and also the world are kind of thought of as liminal places, and liminal is an old Latin word, from Latin, I should say. And it's just, like you said, it's in between places. To be liminal is to be not entirely in one thing or the other. And those are always considered times and places where the other world is closer to the human world and that interaction is more likely. Like you said, the changing of the seasons, the two in particular would be from, I guess we would say spring into summer. In the older understanding, there really was only like winter and summer. So it would be like you would switch from winter to summer on May 1st, and then from summer to winter on November 1st. And those times of year, like the weeks around those times, were seen as these liminal periods where, the good folk, the fairies, were going to be extra present in our world. And we as humans were more likely to encounter them and also maybe accidentally wander out of this reality.
So when we talk about those between times and moving into May 1st, and you said Samhain, right? October 31st. Is there a connection between the fairies and people putting out trick or treats or dressing up to deceive the spirits? Are those treats offerings? I know this isn't on the list, but it just...
No, that's okay. That's a really good question. And this is one of those things that we'll never 100% know for sure. Just because we don't have a lot of the evidence from when some of these things first started. So it's really hard to know exactly why certain folk practices started happening. But it is a pretty common theory that you'll run across that particularly Halloween, our modern holiday of Halloween, was originally based on this idea that these beings are much more present. So especially if you're out after dark, you don't necessarily want them to realize that you're human, because they tend to, again, not necessarily, doesn't necessarily end well for you.
It's a human. Let's play with them.
Yeah, pretty much literally. Like, there's a group in Irish and Scottish folk belief called the Sluagh, which is like the fairy host or the fairy army. And they travel through the air. And particularly at these times of year, if they see someone out by themselves, a human out walking by themselves, they'll lift them up into the air and sometimes take them, very far away and dump them. Sometimes just, they find their way of entertaining themselves in a way that the human does not enjoy at all. There's actually an account, I have a brief advertisement. I have a book coming out in October called Celtic Fairies in North America. And this is a story that I found when I was researching that. But there's an account in Canada, and I believe it was Newfoundland, it might have been Nova Scotia though, of a man who had gone out. There was a big party in his town. He had kind of left the main group, and then people had kind of realized he didn't come back, so they went looking for him. And they followed his footprints until the footprints appeared to, this was in the snow, appeared to disappear into the air, like he had just been carried off. And he eventually shows back up, and he's covered in like seawater that's starting to freeze. So they're all like, what happened to you? And he said that the fairies had pulled him up, picked him up into the air and brought him across the ocean, but they had carried him so low that he kept being hit by the waves, which the fairies thought was hilarious. He did not. He did not enjoy this. He did not think it was funny. But for the fairies, this was like great entertainment. And then they eventually brought him back, which is less common actually in the stories, and returned him to where he'd started from, but much, much worse for wear. So yeah, those sorts of things we definitely have tales about. They will do that.
Those fairies, I kind of like to hear their stories. Like, I understand that we should be respectful. I respect them. I just like their style.
Yeah.
The more I read, the more I'm like, yeah, not that I'm going to try to hang out, because I realize it's not always the best of things to do. But if there wasn't that concern for my safety, we could definitely hang out. Okay, I like some of their philosophies.
They definitely have a good sense of fun, we'll just say, at least for themselves.
Depending on who's interpreting them.
Yeah.
The other question I wanted to ask that was more in depth is that in Fairy, the Otherworld, by many names, you describe the different realms of Fairy. And I'm reading this because there's no way I'm going to get it otherwise. Amongst them in the energetic realm, you state the belief that in this realm is influenced by theosophy. Now, I'm going to say what theosophy is because I had to look it up. And so just in case, I don't want anyone to feel left out. This is a philosophy that maintains that a knowledge of God, or in this case, fairies, may be achieved through spiritual ecstasy, direct intuition, or special individual relations. So not through study or whatever, completely a personal experience thing, right? Am I getting that right, Morgan?
Yeah, the broad strokes, yeah.
And this, so then what made me curious is that you went on to say that this gives people more influence over the land. They feel like they have more influence over the land of Fairy. Now, is that more influence in our interpretation of the land of Fairy, or the land of Fairy itself?
So theosophy is an interesting subject in itself, and it's had a huge impact on a lot of modern beliefs and the modern approaches to certain subjects like fairies. And when theosophy came along, and this would have been the 1880s, 1890s, one of their big concepts was that humans are kind of the highest evolution of spirit, of soul. Everything else is below humans, not talking about divinity, but everything else that's not God is below humans. And everything else is trying to evolve up into being human. So the way that they fit fairies into this was to say that fairies are these extremely primitive spirits who have not had any physical incarnation, and who are like trying to eventually be able to incarnate in some physical sense and work their way up to humans. But in sort of describing all of this, theosophy also made fairies these very sort of fluid, pliable spirits. So theosophy would say, for example, that fairies have no form until a human gives them form by envisioning them in some way. And, that fairies basically are not an individual consciousness. They're kind of this collective consciousness. And that a lot of what they do and how they interact is very strongly influenced by the humans. So we kind of guide them and how they appear and how they act and all this other stuff, which is very different from how fairies are understood across pretty much everything else that's not theosophy. So when theosophy came along, they basically said that the world of fairy, rather than being this concrete, tangible, adjacent world, is actually just this purely energetic realm. Think of it like the land of imagination. It's something that humans can connect to, but it's not anything that can be physically entered into or in any kind of concrete sense engaged with. So it's a very different way to understand it.
Yes. And so, no, I can see because, as you said, they thought of them as lesser beings. So they would have to create who they would be, as they did much of the world. This is who you're going to be. And sort of taking away some of their agency by making them only visible when they wanted them to be visible. So say the same way you would a servant, don't bother me unless I'm I'm calling upon you to do something, right? So I can, yeah, no, I can get that. When there are stories of people, it also makes it like, well, we can just forget about it and make it unreal anytime we want to if this interferes with our other belief systems or our other. So yeah.
Yeah, it puts all the power with the individual human in question.
Hmm. That's really gonna rile them up.
Yeah, it's interesting because it was so completely at odds with all the other folk beliefs, but it has had such a big impact. A lot of modern people, you don't even realize how much of your understanding of fairies is coming from theosophy or from things that were shaped by theosophy.
Well, and this is when we have to get into, Robin, your comment is very important. I'm going to get to it soon. Um, this is part of our understanding with many things, because I think, and you have to balance personal experience with this, but then do you believe all other personal experiences out there? Like, unfortunately, in this spirituality, or any groups, like anything, if, well, let's just say, if you're a Christian and you want to, if you put a cross on a chocolate bar and call it a Christian chocolate bar, you're going to get sales, right? And if you say it was blessed by something, you're going to get sales. So if you say, this is what the fairies told me, if you should be doing oracles or whatever, I'm working with the fairy. It's possible that you are. It's possible that that chocolate bar was blessed too. So I'm not playing any favors here. I'm just going across the boards. But it's possible that it was. But it's also possible that it's a con game. And so, as consumers, as readers, as people who are learning about these subjects, it's important to not say, if someone says this happened, not say, haha, no, it didn't.
No, and that's actually something that I try to really emphasize with people, because I think a lot of people misunderstand my approach to things, because I do tend to be very like, this is what we have evidence for, this is the folk belief, this is where this idea comes from, because I think it's important to understand things like that. But none of that in any way disparages modern experiences and modern encounters. It's just, for me, a matter of giving it context and framing it. So if you personally have an experience or an encounter that is very different from what we have in sort of the existing folklore, that doesn't mean you didn't have that experience. It doesn't mean it wasn't a genuine experience. It just means it's something we don't have that context for. And
right. And as in your book, it's one of them, there are thoughts going through my mind and I'm not sure where I found them. But as you pointed out, they prefer it if you don't speak of your experiences of them a lot out there, because they like to decide who. I mean, I can understand that after going through all of that, they want to decide what press they put out there about themselves.
Agency back. Yeah.
They don't want you talking about them. So no, I've been on Facebook. I've seen I've seen the posts and comments, and so I took the time to figure this out. But yeah, no, I can see that you have with any, and I'm not saying this is a religion. It's a faith. You can be this with any religions, as you can put. Would you let me make my point? It was for you, Morgan. Without the side comments. Now she's lost her place. But what I'm going to with anything, there are people who read all the lore, who study it. There is a base to balance things upon, as opposed to just whatever you decide in the moment is what fairy be. And even that you have to question, because there are prejudices by the people who wrote those myths into a book, because they were usually of the upper class. Those were the people that wrote these things. And so they sort of, once again, thought of these people as lesser beings. And the people who were telling the stories, who were like, you know what, they just think we don't know what we're talking about. We're just silly peasants. So we're going to tell them whatever we want to. I mean, there's all of this stuff. We're not telling them our secrets so they can make money off of it. Like, seriously. So always, which is why Morgan's probably still researching today. And, 20 years from now, if we reach back, Morgan will be on her 4th billion book and still seeking full answers. You gotta love it. Okay,
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. I keep forgetting that Robin, I believe, is originally from Newfoundland. So Robin says, there were old stories in Newfoundland about fairies luring children into the woods disguised as sparrows.
Yeah.
And that, well, they like kids, right? They like kids,
not necessarily in a good way, but yes.
They like to collect them.
Yeah, sometimes, like Pokemon, yes. Newfoundland is an absolutely fascinating place. And it's probably the place in North America that has the most surviving fairy belief. Not that it hasn't survived and you can't find it in other places, but Newfoundland in particular just has a lot of it. Barbara Wrighty has a really good book called Strange Terrain.
Yes, that's what I was just trying to find the name on. Robin, if you're interested, you need to get Morgan's books, but specifically about Newfoundland and Canada, and Strange Terrain by
Barbara Wrighty. I'm probably mispronouncing her last name, and I apologize for that. Wrighty, Rieti, I think it is.
Yeah, I'll. Oh no, did I freeze?
No, you're fine.
Okay. I'm so touching. And thanks for that. That I'm from the area. Shout out there, Robin.
Yeah. And he makes a great point, because we have a lot of stories about the good folk, and not just in Newfoundland, but specifically in Newfoundland, luring people into the woods, which again, not always a good thing for the people that get lured, but yeah.
But I believe that Newfoundland has a large number of Irish immigrants, so that makes sense. And Nova Scotia with Scottish immigrants, because that terrain, I don't know if I will ever get back, not back, but ancestrally back to Ireland or Scotland. But when I go out east, I can almost feel like the landscape in that is so similar that you get those feelings. And I'm sure that the good people would as well. This is what we want. We can play the same games here. Let's go.
Yeah.
Right. So thank you for clearing that up for me, because I have a real understanding of that now, that I didn't have before. Okay. So when we talk about these stories that we've gotten about the past and personal experiences and things like that, I think sometimes we forget that the land of fairy is very much present today. We forget that, the fairies could be dressing in modern clothes instead. I think you brought that up quite a bit in the 21st century fairy, where everybody just thinks they wear these quaint little outfits, and it's gotta annoy them, but especially if they have a great fashion sense. This is how we see things. How do you think perhaps that fairies reach out to us at the Veil or whatever? Are they typing away on the computer, sending us messages?
That is actually a really interesting question in this, particular moment in time, because particularly in the Western world, we're so technology focused. would they be influencing or reaching out through those sorts of means? I certainly think it's possible. I think we're in a really fascinating place right now where, the beliefs of today are still kind of coalescing. And you'll hear people talking about things, but we haven't gotten to that point where there's enough stories, enough experiences to kind of say it conclusively. I wouldn't be surprised, if we get another 10, 20 years down the road and there's all these folk stories about people, receiving private messages or random emails or social media contact or what have you from what they perceive to be the good folk. That is certainly a direction we might be going in at the moment. Historically, they would reach out and connect to people with dreams, visionary experiences, actual tangible experiences. I can't remember if I talked about this in the 21st century one, but I'm going to talk about it again anyway. Where people would have an encounter with someone that they initially thought was human, but then kind of as the encounter goes on, there's some bells ringing that like this isn't normal. The person maybe knows things they shouldn't know, or they appear and disappear kind of inexplicably, or they just sort of have like an aura around them that seems very different and not human. I've actually talked to multiple people who have had experiences like this in the last, 20 or 30 years. And I think that would be very easy to translate into modern technology. I don't know if we would be able to identify them as easily through modern technology as in those other means. But we have stories of fairies interacting with humans and reaching out to humans going back at least 1,500 years. So I don't think that's something that's going to stop necessarily anytime soon. I do think we're in an era at this point where people are much more reluctant to talk about it, because fairies have kind of been, shoved into the children's corner. When people today talk about having a ghost experience or a paranormal experience of some type, that still isn't necessarily widely accepted, but it's more accepted.
Yeah, fairies have been like put in the realm of children.
Yes.
So if you believe in fairies, you will be considered a child, where the other things have much more adult content, and we can't have that. Also, I'm sure there's some prejudice out there towards the source of where the fairies are coming from. The countries and things there. If it comes from Ireland, it is less likely to be taken seriously in a lot of accounts, and that's okay in most cases because Irish people tend. I'm not saying that they do, but they tend to brush things off after many, many generations. But I'm wondering if there's a bit of that too. This comes from there, so it's just.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of we'll just say propaganda over the last 150 years or so, specifically against Irish folk belief, to kind of put it in that zone of it's primitive, quote unquote. It's superstitious. It shows that they're not educated. I mean, this was a big thing, especially in the 1850s through the early 1900s. And I think, unfortunately, one of the side effects of that being so pervasive now is that people are much less likely to say they believe in these things or connect to that necessarily publicly, because it plays into those whole stereotypes and ideas. And there's a lot of reasons why those stereotypes are out there, why the propaganda was happening. Ireland was a colony of England at the time, if that gives you a clue.
Well,
some of the reasons.
Also, they're responsible for a lot of things like unions and that. So if you want to crush those things down, like Vicky, I don't know where this political thing is coming from, but if you want, yes, I'm listening to you. But if you want to crush those things, you first crush the people who are are starting them. So how can you trust people who believe in fairies? There you go. They don't know what they're talking about. It's just all silly business. Back to I'm sorry, Morgan. That wasn't on the agenda, and I just got sidetracked.
We got very deep there for a minute. It's fine.
So unlike me. I always wondered, where did the story about the tooth fairy originate from?
See, this is really interesting. I'm not 100% sure how the tooth fairy became a fairy. Originally, the tooth fairy was a mouse. And this was in, I believe, areas like around Italy. And there's a lot of different superstitions around children's baby teeth and how they need to be handled and what needs to be done with them in pretty much every culture. But at some point in continental Europe, it became this idea that there was this tooth mouse, I think it was primarily a mouse, and that you would give the baby teeth to this magical mouse, and it would be good luck or blessing for the child. And at some point when that got translated over to England, because ideas like this always tend to spread, it became a fairy. And I don't know if that's because it was coming in at a point when fairies were starting to be really strongly associated with children, which would have been during the Victorian era. So I can't 100% say where the idea of the tooth fairy came from, but I know the wider concept of it originally was a mouse. I actually love that it was a mouse. I think that's adorable. This little mouse that would come in and take the baby teeth, and your kid would get blessings and whatever.
You can envision the illustrations, like
Yes.
Beatrice Potter doing these illustrations for the tooth mouse.
Tooth mouse, yep.
So, good question, Susan. Author Susan B. Marcus asks, are brownies and owls in the fairy family?
Sure. So this is a great question, and this, in a modern perspective, is kind of rooted in the way that the word fairy in the last 20, 30 years in particular, but last 100 years in general, we'll say, has come to be associated with just a very specific type of being. So for a lot of people today, when you say fairy, people are going to picture that little winged, childlike sprite kind of being. Whereas for the last 7 or 8 years, and still in some places, when the word fairy is used, it's a catch-all term for any being that comes from that world of fairy, or any of those otherworldly beings. So when we talk about fairies, we're not just talking about the little winged sprites, we're talking about human-like beings, we're talking about, there's a fairy cat, there's fairy hounds, there's fairy horses, there's a whole range of beings that come in this world that would be labeled generally as fairies. So when we talk about things like brownies, which are a being found particularly in Scottish folk belief, they fall into that sort of umbrella category of fairies. When we're talking about things like elves, elves are actually a hugely complicated topic because they're found in a whole bunch of different cultures, and the different cultures tend to have slightly different understandings of them. Like elves in England have kind of also been sort of miniaturized. We think of like the shoemaker's elves, Santa's elves. So there's that kind of concept, but elsewhere in other cultures, like if you talk about elves in Scotland, you're talking about the very human-like, powerful, otherworldly beings. We're talking about them in Iceland. You get a whole range of both of those things kind of showing up. But they would, yes, be considered generally as fairies. If you go back to like the 16th, 17th century in Scotland, the two words would be used interchangeably. So you'll have sources that talk about elf-like fairies and fairy-like elves. And it was clear there just wasn't a distinction between the concepts. It was just different words.
And like I put up Robin's comment here because leprechauns would most definitely be fairies as well. Right?
In that broader general category, yeah. It gets really complicated when we start trying to look at what would or wouldn't be fairies within non-English speaking cultures. I'll just say, because there's a whole argument that goes on about whether any of the Irish otherworldly beings really even should be called fairies, or whether that causes more confusion because we have so many ideas of what the word fairy means. And I mean, you could say the same thing for Welsh or anything else. So that's opening a whole kettle of fish, as they say. But in general, loose terms, yes, a leprechaun. Pretty much any being you can think of that you would name is mostly going to fall into that wider umbrella category of fairy. We really don't have a specific fairy being as much.
Right, because, yeah, I get that. Okay, so probably because I got off on political fairy talk.
Fairy politics.
I want to move into your other book that you recently re-released, Fairy Faith for Children, and for ages 10 to 12. And as I just want to do a mini review here, as I told Morgan before, I love this book. I love all of her books, but this one specifically in the category of 10 to 12, because it doesn't speak down to children. It doesn't, it understands where they are at that age. It doesn't get them in trouble. It says if mom and dad don't want you to have a fairy altar or a fairy house, check with them first. You can make your journal so that you have those private thoughts, and reminding them that fairies do not like to be discussed opening, which would also protect them from being teased or bothered by other kids or adults. So well done. I strongly recommend it for anyone who has a child who is interested in fairies.
Thank you. Yeah, that was my first traditionally published book. It came out, I believe, in 2012. 5 billion years ago, it feels like at this point. It was through a very small publisher, and they had a series called The Child's Eye View. And so it was a child's eye view of all these different, mostly sort of esoteric pagan subjects. And I had been approached and asked if I would be interested in doing a child's eye view of the fairy faith. At this point, I had still published a couple books, but I had been teaching and talking about fairies publicly since 2000. So I think that was why I was the one for that particular topic. I don't know. Or they just stumbled across my name and needed to fill a quota. I don't know. But either way, they approached me, and at the time, my oldest child was, I believe, 9 when I was writing it. So it seemed perfect for me. Wanted something that I could give to my oldest kid. Normally children would grow up in the fairy faith and this sort of structure of belief, and we don't have that anymore in a lot of places, particularly here, like in the US. So I thought it was a great idea. It was a great series. I wrote it, it got put out, and what ended up happening, unfortunately, is that small publisher went out of business. So probably 4 or 5 years ago now, unless it was right before COVID, the publisher went out of business. You couldn't get the book anymore, and I didn't think too much of it. And then maybe a year ago, I had found out that I had gotten the copyright back. So this is something people, if you don't write, you might not be aware of this. When you write a book through a traditional publisher, you sign a contract that basically gives that publisher the rights to that book. I can't submit a book to a publisher and then publish it myself or do anything else with it. They have the rights to publish it, not me. If that makes sense to everyone. So when I wrote this book for this little publisher, I basically gave it to them, and then they published it, and that was that. When they went out of business, I wasn't too concerned about what I was going to do. But when I found out I got my copyright back, which meant I could then put the book out myself if I wanted to, I took a look at it and realized in the 12 years since I'd originally written it, there were certain things that I felt a little differently about. There were certain things I thought I could maybe say a little better, include material a little differently. So I went back and I did an updated version which in some places is significantly different from the original. In other places, it's basically the same, just depended on the section. And I self-published it and put it back out because I still think it's a great idea to have on the market. Something that's aimed for that age group that is saying, you know, you can engage with this if you want, but just be careful of certain things. And, you know, this is the safe way to approach doing this if it interests you.
And just to remind the adults out there that in this book, and because they are so they really care about keeping deals and being fair, the fairy beans, that they really do like happy, generous, and kind people. And I know that it's not always easy to be happy, but you know, if when we can, we do that, it would not only make the fairies happy, but also improve the world around us a little, perhaps. And you might get a secret treasure showing up sometime. There's always that.
I think the world would be a much better place if more people were trying to live to make the fairies like them. You know, because it's kindness, generosity, trying to be happy, being fair, being honest, keeping your promises. Like, these are all things that would benefit a lot of humanity.
Well, this is why I do like them, and you know, under safe circumstances would like to hang out, because I agree with a lot of their core values and beliefs. Like, if you make a deal, keep it. If you make a promise, do your best to keep it. Be kind to people, because you know, and all of these things, I think they have it going on in their philosophies. That's just. And I also want to state that this book is only, I mean, it's not a huge book, it's for 10 and 12-year-olds, but it's only $2.99 in Canada on you know, that platform I don't want to say the name of, but used constantly.
Unfortunately, the
on Amazon.
Self-publishing is the Evil Empire. So, it's through that. My self-published fiction is also through that. It's.
Oh no, you have to. I think people have to understand that the same as if SoundCloud or Spotify is where musicians, this is the way to go. Everybody goes to Amazon. And so I wasn't being, you know, I have no great moral values, people. Okay.
Amazon, there's a lot of good reasons to criticize Amazon. That's fair. But unfortunately, if you're self-publishing, it really is one of the...
It's where
markets.
Everybody goes, because it is known. And so, you know, and the books are out there, and that's not even so much hard copies, but ebooks. That is...
And unfortunately, Amazon is also, because it's so large, it is actually one of the easiest ones to self-publish through. Like, their process is very straightforward. Their technology is very straightforward. I have tried other smaller self-publishing platforms, but it's so much more difficult to use. So I think that contributes to it too. Even if you want to go to other things, sometimes you realize it's a much more difficult process.
Well, and then you're getting all your reviews in one place. And all of those contribute to getting the book out there. Sometimes I think on one hand, you're getting all those different markets, but on the other hand, you're spreading out the info, right? If there are reviews or whatever. So it's just the way the world is.
It's unfortunately true these days, because there's so much on the market. Literally every day there's hundreds of thousands of new books being published. It's just
it's
ridiculous amount.
It's crazy.
Of options. And now with some of the AI writing, it's gotten a lot worse. So you have to, as an author, you have to try to reach the audience the best that you can, you know, through all of that.
So You said, and I'm just moving on. I'm not cutting on. I could discuss this subject forever.
Please move on.
Morgan, I wish somebody would just pick me up by the shoulders and carry me to your house so we could have one cup of coffee and just go on for a few hours.
It would be a whole pot of coffee.
So you said at the beginning of Here We Go, Fairy, the Otherworld by Many Names, that this was a subject that you could spend a lifetime studying and not completely understand, meaning fairies. And you have dedicated yourself to that as well. You just put out book 12 of your indie fiction Between the World series, as well as these other things. So therefore dedicating yourself to that series and other fiction work you have, which I'm going to have to get, because if I keep reading these books, I really have to get the pronunciations down. You have a couple of learning Irish interpretation.
Irish translations. Yep.
That's it. Okay, Irish translations. I'm getting excited now. I'm losing Irish translations for this work, which did I read that you might be getting those? They're now independent. You might be getting those published, or were you in negotiation with that?
Yes. So I've been writing for Moon Books, which is imprint of Collective Ink out of London in the UK, for 10 or 11 years now. I think it's 11 now. And I've consistently worked with one particular editor, Trevor Greenfield. He's amazing.
Yay, Trevor.
Trevor deserves all the applause. And he had actually approached me because he knew that I was self-publishing this translation work that I've been doing for the last 9 or 10 years, and had asked me if I'd be interested in maybe submitting it through Moon and seeing if they would be interested in it. And I initially did not think that was going to go anywhere, because generally publishers will not take on previously self-published.
Right, it's already been out there kind of thing.
Yeah, it's like an unwritten rule that when you initially put a book out, it's going to get the best sales, and then it will just be whatever, slow and steady after that. So taking on something self-published, a lot of people just won't do it. But Moon was actually pretty enthusiastic, and it's going to be, it's envisioned to be a 3-book series. The first book is in copy editing now. It should be out next year, around this time next year. And it's a collection of material I've already put out, self-published, as well as a couple new pieces. And then the following year, there will be a second edition, which will be other work that I've done with some new pieces. And then I'm currently working on translating the Tonbo Cooley, which is the big Irish epic story of Cullen and Cattle Raid and the Ulster story. It's probably the most well-known Irish epic. It is a massive project, and so that I probably won't be done with for another couple of years. But once I'm done, they're going to publish that as well, provided everything goes well with the other.
So much to look forward to. Should I wait for the translation book to come out through them? Will it be more, or?
I would encourage people, if you're interested in my translation work, the one coming out through Moon Books is going to be a really nice edition. It's also going to have stuff that is not public at this point, new translations. And I think that, if you wait for that, it'll be worth the wait. And then the one following that, the next year, Volume 2, I would say the same thing about. That's my translation of the adventure stories, the Kamoitura. And then I just did the Cauldrons of Posy, which is a pretty well-known piece. It's difficult to find in English. So that's going to be in the second book. So lots of good stuff if you're interested in Irish myth translations.
Yeah, well, yes. And I think you should be. So we should be interested in everybody's mythology. Like, this is my whole point. If we go back and hear how each of the same type of stories formulate, we're going to see we have way more in common than we think. It's just everybody understands that, and it's always a good go-to. Okay, so Book 12, I haven't kept up. I need more reading time in my life. Book 12 of your Between the Worlds series. Is this the book, or will there be more in the series?
The big question. I don't know that the characters are done saying what they want to say. I thought when I wrote book 11, which is called Convergence, that was going to be the last one. It kind of left in a good place, and it wasn't a firm ending, but it could definitely be a place to stop that I thought people would be satisfied with. But then this sort of idea for the next book came along, and I think it came out really well. You know, readers seem to like it, which is really good.
You were pleased with yourself. This is good.
Yeah. So at this point, I don't have any current plans for the next book. I want to work on a sequel to Into Shadow, which is a high fantasy novel I did through Cosmic Egg. That has not sold well at all, so I don't know if they'll even let me do a sequel, but I do want to write it. I've had a lot of people who did read the book ask for the sequel. So I figure I'll write it, and then I'll figure out from there.
It just as a short thing about the books, Morgan's characters are not your typical characters, and I am particularly fond of the hero in their Into the Shadows book. So looking forward for a second one. And also with the Between the Worlds series, you don't have to wait now to get the books for the sequels. Like, there are 12. You can start reading knowing that the story will continue and it will be an easy access to get. I know my son was asking, he had a friend and she was into these types of books. And he said, which do I get her? Because he had listened to the show. And I said, how about she starts with Between the Worlds? Because it's all there. And then she doesn't have to wait so far between.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
Generally, the last few years I've been a little slower, but generally I do write at least a book a year for that series, sometimes more. So I started writing it in 2014, and we've got 12 books at this point. So if you like that sort of series, there's definitely a good one to invest in.
Right, because it's not a big investment either for
it's
what
not
you
gonna be 10 years till the next book.
Yeah, I think they're less than a fancy cup of coffee.
I do try to keep my prices really reasonable.
I've seen messages where she said that.
Yeah, I do my best. The ebooks in particular, I keep really low. Most people now have raised theirs like $4.99, $5.99, and mine. I think the first book, Murder Between the Worlds, is $1.99 on ebook, and then the rest of the series are mostly $2.99. So
really, it's been a while since I purchased it. So yeah, far less than even a regular cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Trying
to be reasonable for people. I just want to get the story out there.
And yes, and read it. Just read them. Okay. So, and you are updating the covers on your Between the Shadows books with an artist.
I am. So when I did Into Shadow through Cosmic Egg, I had contacted an artist named Valerie Heron, who is out of Seattle. She's amazing. And asked her if she would illustrate the cover because I liked her style. She had not done book covers previously, but I had seen other artwork she'd done. And I have a copy here. And I just really liked...
I love that cover. I love the colors. I
liked her style. I liked her approach. And I just had a feeling that she would be the best choice to illustrate what I wanted. To show the characters the way I was seeing them and the way I wanted readers to initially meet them. And I loved how that came out. So despite the fact that it's 12 books, so it's going to take a while and not be inexpensive, I contacted her about doing covers for the Between the Worlds series. Part of what motivated that is that as someone who had been making my own covers through like Canva and similar online programs, I have a very strong anti-AI stance in writing, but also in artwork. Me personally, I do not support AI in the arts. And I was getting concerned as I was trying to make new covers about how difficult it is to sort out whether stock images are AI or not. And there's been some scandals in the indie publishing industry, if we can call it that, with people who used AI artwork, because a lot of people are very against it. And I did not want to have to worry about that. And I know Valerie is a real, genuine, certified human. And I know how she makes her art. I know that she, kind of ethically is in line with where I was going. So I thought that it would be a better option to go to her to do covers. And also, I think the covers just are so much better when it's the second book in the series, Lost in Mist.
That, yes.
When you have an artist doing it, they can really make it very personalized. They can make it,
and it gives it their style. There's a unique style. But as you said, it is not inexpensive. I know that I'm still waiting on my little logo brand thing because I asked the author about it. But you have to save your pennies out there, people. There's none of these, there isn't an indie author out there that I know of that's making millions of dollars. So it's going to take you a while, but it's
we're on cover 2 now, or I should say cover 2 has come out. She's starting the work for cover 3. I suspect we'll get maybe 2 to 3 covers a year. So it's going to take multiple years. And I keep writing the books, which makes it harder.
Yeah, well, you're not making it so easy on me either. That's why I'm just like, okay, I wanted to fit in a couple of Between the Worlds while doing this episode, because it's been a little bit, but I just couldn't fit them in, Morgan. Still she continues. Okay, I just want to get through a couple of things here, because we're going over time because that's the kind of rebel we are. Celtic Fairies is come in North America, so Newfoundland or whatever, is coming out on November 1st, 2024. Do you want to give us a little bit of a teaser there, the little promo?
Sure. So Celtic Fairies in North America started because I constantly get questions about whether there are Celtic fairies outside of Europe, but particularly in North America. And I knew that there was a lot of evidence for this, but I had increasingly started running into people saying, no, that's not possible. That's not a thing. That they aren't here at all. It's not a thing. And so I felt like, I really need to get a book out there that lays out the evidence we have and the folk belief we have. And this covers Canada, the United States, and to some degree Mexico. And I do clarify, because the Mexico chapter is not gigantic, that I do not speak fluent Spanish, and that did limit my researching because a lot of the best source material is, of course, in Spanish. So I had to stick with what I could find that was primarily in English. But there is evidence of these beings across sort of all these places in folk belief. People have encounters historically and modern terms, and I thought it was really important to put that out there to clarify it and to answer that question. Are they here? And the answer is yes, but let's also look at how long we have stories of them being here and kind of the layers and all with that.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept to get into how much of a relationship these other beings have with their relatives on another continent, like how interwoven are their worlds. We travel back and forth. We have, the old country, we have whatever. I'm sure it's probably the same for them in a way, right?
Yeah, we have some stories of places where they all seem to get along. We have some stories of places where they don't seem to get along. The Celtic cultural fairies versus the indigenous fairies. I shouldn't say fairies. Indigenous beings that are fairy-like is the better way to put that. Because we do have beings that are indigenous to the Americas that are very similar to what we would consider fairies in Europe, but clearly different cultures, different terms, So we just want to make sure we're not causing any confusion by using that word in a way.
No,
Something
you.
not accurate.
I know that I've watched a lot. It's you're walking a tightrope there, girl. Because it's just there are so many things that have been brought to our attention recently that very sensitive people are working their hardest to keep up with it and not hurt anyone or anything along the way, and inadvertently we do anyways. But we try your best, and you try your best, Morgan.
We are doing our best.
And sometimes we fail, like I just did it a minute ago, but I can't go back there now.
Well, and everyone, it's always going to happen, and I'm usually pretty good about saying fairy-like, so it was a slip. I said fairies, and I corrected myself, and that's the best we can do,
That's all you can do. Okay, and finally, the big question: where can people find more info on you? And we've already went to one of the sources, Amazon, but where else can they find your books?
So my books you can find in most booksellers, Barnes and Noble. If you don't like Amazon, is another online option. You can find them sometimes in brick and mortar stores, and if they don't have them, you can always ask if they can get them. My self-published material, unfortunately, you are a little more limited in where you can get that, just because of the nature of self-publishing. But the majority of my nonfiction you can get in different online sources as well as some physical stores. And me in general, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, which I will never stop calling Twitter. That's one thing
that's hard. But it's how do you and on X, that doesn't have the same.
I refuse. Everyone has their hard line, or their line in the sand, and that's it
and you're just not going to change the name in your mind, or
I will not. Twitter forever. So I am on Twitter, at least for the moment. We'll see, because that site is getting extra interesting right now. And I have a Patreon, so I'm kind of everywhere on social media, sadly. It's usually just under my name, Morgan Daimler. I will say, because there's a lot of fake accounts now and cloned accounts and things, it is just Morgan Daimler. There's no extra characters or letters or weirdness. And I never private message people for soliciting purposes. So if you find me on social media and connect with the account, and then you're getting a message saying that, like, my grand rising high ascension ancestor told me to offer you a reading, that's not me.
That's not anyone, okay? Never take business. But if they do say, please buy my indie book.
that might be me, yeah. Please read my fiction, that might be me. But otherwise it's not. So
that's it. Well, thank you so much. It's always so much fun to have you back, and I'm actually glad that you keep writing new books, because then I can keep having you back with the new books.
I like to keep busy, so
and you do, and you keep other busy people busy along the way, busy reading, busy learning, the whole thing. So we will see you soon, and I'm looking forward to all the books, but yeah, I will particularly find the translation book so useful. So thank you for that.
Awesome.
Bye.
Thank you for having me on.
Take care. Okay, for the rest of you, next week, Daniela Samina will be visiting with her latest Herbs for Fairy Magic. You've got it. Fairies back to back. Herbs with Fairy Magic will be released on August 30th. So you'll find out about it before, and then you can go purchase it right away. Until then, may your coffee be hot and your story sweet. Thanks for listening, everyone.